Welcome to Grow with Purpose. This is the Axiom Podcast, and today we're going to do something a little bit different. It's just me in the studio, and one of the phrases I heard years ago through Global Leadership Summit, I think was the first place I heard it, is that leaders are readers. And so what I try to do is read as much as possible, never as much as I want. I'm way overly ambitious in the number of books I buy versus the number of books I read. Just having a conversation with Carrie on our team this morning, and we both share an aversion to getting rid of books. That's not a thing that I believe in, so I have faith that one day I'm going to read all these books. But in the course of reading recently, there's two books that have been on my bookshelf for a long, long time, and for whatever reason, picked them up, reread them. They're both by the same author. And what was really interesting to me is there was a noticeable change in the author between these two books. It was like a part one and part two, and we'll get to that part. So it just got me thinking. There are some things that you read and you're learning as much about the author as you are about the content. And you're learning that through the content, sometimes in a very nuanced way, and other times a little bit more explicitly. So today we're going to talk about one of those authors. And his name is OG Mandino. And he's from the 1950s, 1960s. He's born in 1923. I'll get into a little bit more of his life story in a second. But he wrote these two books. The first book that was ever recommended to me was called The Greatest Salesman in the World. And then he wrote a follow-up to that book called The Greatest Salesman in the World, Part 2. And when you read those two books, especially if you read them back to back, you start to notice some very stark differences. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And I've got some prepared remarks. I may take a break from those periodically, but I had to get all this down on paper because I couldn't just riff on this without making it like a 2-hour podcast. So let's get started. So today we're going to be talking about Og Mandino, and we're going to dive into these two kind of timeless books. And this is part of a genre that we may get more into. It might be called the self-help genre or positive psychology genre. Something that I got kind of caught up in during college, was my first introduction by a book by Napoleon Hill called Think and Grow Rich that a lot of people have read. But we're going to look at the people behind the books in talks like this, and in this section we talk about Og Mandino. And he's best known for this short book, The Greatest Salesman in the World. It was published in 1968. But what makes his story so compelling isn't just what he wrote, it's who he became. And it's how his perspective shifted between his first book and the sequel, The Greatest Salesman in the World, Part 2, the end of the story, which was written 20 years later. So in this episode, we're going to be talking about that evolution, how Mandino went from a man hungry for success to a man rooted in purpose and service. And I think by the end, you'll see both messages. You'll see both success and significance. And those messages are still relevant today, maybe especially relevant today. Mandino was born in 1923. By the way, his name, Og, unique name. Never heard that one anywhere. I don't think that makes baby names lists today. But Og Mandino, born in 1923 in Massachusetts. As a young man, he served in World War II as a bomber pilot, flying over 30 missions in Europe. After the war, he returned home, and he tried to build a career in insurance, but he struggled badly. In the early 1950s, he found himself unemployed, divorced, alcoholic, and contemplating suicide. One snowy morning, with plans to buy a gun and end his life, Og wandered into a public library instead. That moment changed everything. He picked up a book by W. Clement Stone and Napoleon Hill titled Success Through a Positive Mental Attitude, one of the early success and positive thinking writers. And from there, Og began to rebuild his life. He eventually became a successful salesman, then a writer. And in 1968, he released The Greatest Salesman in the World, a small parable that went on to sell more than 50 million copies worldwide. It was a life turnaround of epic proportions. But what's even more fascinating is what happened after the success, the evolution of Mandino's message. Let's take a look at The Greatest Salesman in the World, Book 1. I'm not going to go through like a book summary. That's not the purpose of this. I really just wanted to, in a short podcast, kind of capture uh, the message and how it evolved. But in The Greatest Salesman in the World, Book 1, it's written as a parable. It's fairly short. You can read it in one or two sittings. And the main character in that book is a guy named Hafid. It's set in the Middle East. You can kind of tell it's an Arab culture. And the main character is Hafid. He's a poor camel boy who becomes this great salesman. But the real power of the book lies in these 10 ancient scrolls that were bequeathed to Hafid by his mentor, who was also a successful merchant. And Hafid went to work for this merchant, and he was desperate as a young boy to have the success that he saw in this very successful merchant. So the merchant gives him these 10 scrolls, and you get the feeling that the merchant's kind of been waiting for the right person. He gives Hafid this test. He passes the test. He can see the ambition. He can see the desire to be successful. And so he gives them these 10 scrolls with instructions to read a scroll, I think for a week or a month, and to just read that scroll until it becomes kind of ingrained in him and he understands the principle that's identified in the scroll. And then he can move on to the next one. So Hafid diligently does this. And these 10 principles, these 10 kind of life principles, result in him becoming very successful. So just to give you an idea, here's a few of the scrolls. So scroll 2 says, I will greet this day with love in my heart. And if you read the book or if you've read the book, you know that's the one sentence message. And then there's a whole chapter on what that, kind of you talking to yourself about how you will greet this day with love in my heart. So it's very like first person. Scroll 3 is I will persist until I succeed. Scroll 4 is I am nature's greatest miracle. So there's 10 of these. And they're intensely personal. They're about forming habits, overcoming rejection, developing discipline. They're written for the hustler, the striver, the person who's trying to rebuild. And you get a sense I didn't know Og Mandino's story about, utter failure, contemplating suicide, alcoholic. I didn't know any of that when I read, but you can once you know that, you're like, oh, of course. A lot of this is him aspiring to overcome the challenges and get rid of a lot of the head trash that he was carrying around that was no doubt responsible for some of the circumstances he found himself in. And so this desire by a young striver, an ambitious young man, a hustler, it makes sense because that's where he was when he wrote it. He had achieved some success after he wrote it, but you got to believe that the memory of those down days was still very fresh and raw. And this is a man who had rebuilt his life by mastering himself. And now he wants to hand these tools over to other people. The tone is very energetic. It's very practical. It's very hopeful. Sometimes, a little bit too sweet and drippy. I like data. I like facts. To be honest, going through this book the first time, I was kind of like, this kind of sounds a little hokey pokey type stuff, hocus pocus. But nevertheless, sold 50 million copies, so a lot of people resonated with it. And what he introduces as the 10 scrolls in this first book could be described as 10 daily affirmations. They're short, they're focused declarations that you repeat regularly to shape your mindset and reinforce your values. And this actually isn't just feel-good fluff. There's research in psychology and neuroscience that shows when affirmations are tied to your core beliefs, and that's critical. If you don't believe it, if you can't wrap your head around it, if you feel like you're just uttering nonsense, they can actually do more harm than good. But when things like daily affirmations that you repeat every morning and every evening, and you try to drive these things into your consciousness, when they're based on core values, they can be very powerful. They can reduce stress. They can improve problem solving. They can even strengthen your brain's ability to handle challenges. It's a way of rewiring your internal dialogue. So instead of being driven by fear or doubt, you're actually anchored in purpose and possibility. If you're curious about the science behind daily affirmations, which is kind of a rabbit hole I went down because, again, I'm a cynic, so I like to see, like, is there anything to this? If you want to see how they actually work, how they actually influence the brain, there's some solid research you can look up. So I'd say look up Self-Affirmation Theory by Claude Steele, or check out studies by researchers like Emily Falk or Shelley Taylor on how affirmations affect stress and motivation. A good starting point is a 2009 study by Joanne Wood that explores when affirmations work and when they don't. I'll put these in the show notes so that you can have a quick way to get to them. But the big picture we see of Mandino as author of book one is a young man who's hungry for success, just like Hafid, the protagonist. And the scrolls are this tool by which he sets out to become wildly successful. And you see at the end of that book, that's exactly what's happened. Now we move on. Fast forward 20 years. In 1988, which, I wasn't alive when Mandino wrote the first book. In 1988, I was middle school age. 1988, Mandino releases part two, The End of the Story. And here's where things get really interesting. In the second book, Hafid is an old man. He's preparing to pass on the scrolls to a new generation. In fact, he's exactly where his mentor was, kind of waiting for the right person to show up to hand these scrolls off to. And so there's no spoilers, but I'll also just kind of say, like, the tone of this book is a lot quieter. It's a lot deeper. It's more reflective. And so three of the scrolls, I'll give you three examples from the second book, and you can hear the difference. So just to kind of recap, in the first book, we had one of the scrolls said, "I will greet this day with love in my heart." The scroll 4 in the second book says, "I will trust in God." Scroll 3, "I will persist until I succeed," from the first book. And then there's a scroll in the second book says, "I will be a servant to all." In the first book, we have this scroll called "I am nature's greatest miracle." And in the last scroll in book 2, it says, "I will finish the race." So you got to think, Mandino's written this book. It sold 50 million copies. He's like, okay, that was a pretty good formula. So I'm just going to go back to that formula, and I'm going to release 10 new scrolls. These are the scrolls that the successful protagonist, Hafid, like, he's at the end of his life. He's nearing the end of his life, and his job is to kind of get this message out. And so he's challenged to come up with these 10 even more timeless principles. So there's a huge difference in that the first set of scrolls are all about becoming successful. In the second book, they're really about finishing well, about letting go, about living for others rather than for yourself. Mandino himself was no longer a struggling salesman. By this time, he's wildly successful. He's a best-selling author. He's a speaker. He's a man of faith. And that shift in his own heart really shows up in these scrolls and in the words that he's putting into book 2. So when I read these two books side by side, I can't help but ask myself, which scroll am I living right now? I can definitely identify with that young guy, even though I'm not a young guy anymore, that ambition, the drive, the desire to be successful. But I also am thinking a lot more about, am I building something? Am I learning how to let go? Am I striving, or am I actually serving people, serving the people on my team first when it comes to business, serving my family first when it comes to everything else, serving clients? It's still on the list, but I think earlier in my career, serving clients was the means by which I knew I would become successful. And now I see my role as serving team members who are going to be here doing the work long after I'm not. And so I also resonate. I got to say, like, book 2 had much more of an impact on me. It felt, and I think a ton of that has to do with when I read it. Had I read the first book, and I probably read the first book 20 years ago. Had I read book 2 20 years ago, I don't know if it would have resonated. So it's kind of interesting how I ran into these two books at different points in my life, and they kind of found me at the right spot. The truth is, you kind of need both of these things. You can't finish a race if you've never started it, and you can't lead others if you've never led yourself. So book 1 is really about how do I lead myself well, and book 2 is like, okay, having done that, now how do I lead others well? Book 1 gives us a foundation: discipline, courage, persistence. Book 2 reminds us why those things matter, so we can serve, so we can live well, and so we can finish with peace. And in a word, that's obsessed. I should cut that out. And in a world that's obsessed with hustle and grind, book 2 might be the message that more of us need to hear, especially today. So that's the journey of Og Mandino. He's a man who was chasing success early in his life to a man who was rooted in service. There's 2 books written 20 years apart. It's the same character, it's the same format, but it's a very different tone, even a different message. I hope that covering these 2 things gives you a moment to reflect on where you're at. What's the scroll you might need in this season, or what's the type of scroll that you might need in this season? If this conversation resonated with you, we're going to do a short leadership guide that kind of takes these 2 kind of dichotomies in terms of the message and gives you some ways to discuss those with your team. Gives you some, even if you just want to take this personally, and give you some things to think about, maybe some questions to think about and answer, and put your thoughts down on paper. I find that helps me a ton. So download the leadership guide. You can find it in the show notes to this podcast. You can go to our website at axiomstrategic.com and find the podcast page, and all of this stuff will be there as well.